webinar for state and local fiscal recovery funds, and our recent guidance on how to use these funds for affordable housing development. I wanted to give you a quick run of show, and I'll turn it over to our speakers. We'll start with Jacob Liebenluft, who is the Chief Recovery Officer at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And following him will be Noel Pollo, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Community and Economic Development. And after they give you a brief overview of this guidance and our intention with this guidance and what we hope to see you do, we will pass it back to me and some of my colleagues who will brief you on the guidance. So for now, I'll turn it over to Jacob Liebenluft.
Thank you so much, Namratha, and thanks to everyone for joining this call. I want to just start by actually thanking all of you in this Zoom who have been such leaders in your states, localities, territories, and tribes in addressing the challenges that have emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that it's been a long 2.5 years for many of you, and the work that you've done has helped so many families stay safe and housed during an unprecedented time. I'm excited to talk to you today about Treasury's new guidance on affordable housing in the state and local fiscal recovery funds program, and how that will help expand our nation's housing supply, which is so vital to addressing a shortage of affordable housing and lowering costs in the long term. My name is Jacob Liebenluft. I'm Treasury's Chief Recovery Officer, and in that role, I oversee Treasury's pandemic relief and recovery efforts, including the state and local fiscal recovery fund, as well as other initiatives like the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and the Homeowner Assistance Fund. As folks on this call know very well, our nation has faced a serious and increasing affordable housing shortage for decades. Chronic underinvestment in affordable housing is a key driver of rising housing costs. And this challenge has been exacerbated by the pandemic, as housing prices make up almost a quarter of recent cost increases for the American people. Today, Moody's Analytics estimates that the shortage in housing supply is more than 1.5 million homes nationwide. And this shortage is particularly critical for low and moderate income families. So it's a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration and for the Treasury Department to address the challenge of housing affordability, including its causes. So we work to provide broad flexibility for the use of state and local fiscal recovery funds, including for affordable housing uses, in the final rule we issued in January. And we've encouraged the use of SLFRF funds on housing in our communications to state and local and tribal governments. Secretary Yellen and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo have both highlighted places that are using these funds towards affordable housing during their travels across the United States over the past several months. But we also received significant feedback, including from many of you on this call, about how we might make it simpler and easier for recipients to spend on affordable housing and development in accordance with the final rule. In response, we recently released 2 guidance updates that build on the progress we've seen and that we expect will help state, local, territorial, and tribal officials fulfill and expand commitments, helping to boost the country's supply of affordable housing and bring down costs for the American people over time. These updates were heavily informed by you on this call, by the clear message that you sent about the interest in investing in housing, and feedback about what Treasury could do in our guidance to help support that goal. So we're hopeful that these changes will facilitate significant additional financing for affordable housing projects, including those that would be eligible for additional assistance under the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And we encourage you, as Secretary Yellen and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, as well as our partners at the White House have done, to work with us to increase your commitments of SLFRF funds towards affordable housing. Over the coming weeks and months, we look forward to lifting up commitments and projects that use American Rescue Plan funds and to show the results of these efforts. So today we're going to get into the details of our recent guidance, as well as answer a few questions. Before we do that, I want to pass it to Noel Pollo, Treasury's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community and Economic Development, and someone who's been a leader in our efforts around housing generally and around some of the developments we're talking about today, to discuss how these updates fit into Treasury and the administration's broader work on housing. Noel, welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Jacob. As you said, my name is Noel Andres Pollo. I am a Deputy Assistant Secretary here at Treasury. And I've had the privilege of supporting Jacob and the rest of Treasury's senior leadership on housing issues. I hope I can provide just some additional context for how important this announcement has been. While we can't overlook the fact that too many people in this country have faced housing instability in recent years, look, resources from the American Rescue Plan and this administration's rapid actions have prevented what would have undeniably been a disaster for millions of people and disproportionately for communities of color. And the eviction moratorium in combination with emergency rental assistance prevented millions of evictions. Foreclosure moratoria, guidance to servicers and the Homeowners Assistance Fund have prevented another foreclosure crisis. These were major achievements. And I think sometimes it's hard to see achievements that were something that didn't happen. But I think it's important to acknowledge it as we enter into this conversation, and also to acknowledge that those achievements, we are not satisfied yet. It's precisely because we recognize that too many people have gone without housing that they can reasonably afford that this administration is acting to address housing affordability challenges that have faced this nation, prior to the pandemic. And so the state and local fiscal recovery fund guidance, the changes that we've recently announced really build on the president's stated commitment to invest in housing. That commitment was defined in the Housing Supply Action Plan that was released in May. And it represents an all-of-government approach to closing this gap of affordability in our country. The Housing Supply Action Plan presents clear and detailed solutions to creating and preserving more homes, increasing investment in multifamily housing, including in rural areas, and easing burdensome land use and land regulations that make it difficult to produce units, among other key priorities designed to reduce housing costs. The administration has also proposed initiatives that will provide more funding and regulatory flexibility, to increase the housing supply and bring down costs for everyone in this country. As a part of the Housing Supply Action Plan, Treasury has worked closely with the White House, with HUD, and with other agencies on the state and local fiscal recovery guidance, as we did on the emergency rental assistance guidance, as we did on the Homeowner Assistance Fund guidance. And all of these efforts were designed to help increase the supply of affordable housing. Our nation's affordable housing shortfall is an issue that affects everyone in this country, in every part of this country, and across income spectrums. We know this, and the Biden-Harris administration is working to address these challenges using a whole of government approach, including through significant investments using American Rescue Plan funds. But let's dig into the details around this state and local fiscal recovery guidance. I want to pass it now off to the rest of our team to walk through the guidance, the recent updates and how they fit. Namrata, let me pass it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Noel. And thank you, Jacob, as well, for sharing that context. We're really excited for the work that all of our recipients are doing, and to have affordable housing stakeholders here as part of this call for us to discuss this guidance with you. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Namrata Mazumdar. I'm the Policy Outreach Lead for State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. And now we'll turn over to a brief overview of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program. Next slide, please. The State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act, delivers $350 billion to state, territorial, local, and tribal governments across the country to support their response to and from the recovery from the COVID-19 public health emergency. Recognizing that historically underserved communities, including low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, experienced disproportionate impacts of the pandemic, when implementing the SLFRF program, Treasury sought to encourage recipients to address economic disparities, such as affordable housing, to ensure that the recovery from the pandemic is truly an equitable economic recovery. Next slide, please. The State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program provides substantial flexibility for each jurisdiction to meet local needs within the 4 separate eligible use categories. First, recipients can replace lost public sector revenue, using this funding to provide government services up to the amount of revenue lost due to the pandemic. As many of you know, recipients can either calculate revenue loss using the formula in the final rule or take the $10 million standard allowance. Revenue loss is the most flexible eligible use category under the SLFRF program, and funds are subject to streamlined reporting and compliance requirements. Recipients should be mindful that certain restrictions, which are detailed further in the restrictions on use section of the overview of the final rule and apply to all eligible use categories. This also applies to government services and the use under revenue loss. We've made this eligible use even more flexible recently with the release of FAQ 13.15, which tailors the applicability of subparts D and E of the uniform guidance to this eligible use category. I want to discuss the next eligible use category. Recipients can use funds to support the COVID-19 public health and economic response by addressing COVID-19 and its impact on public health, as well as addressing economic harms to households, small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, and the public sector. When we released the final rule, we intended to provide broad flexibility for SLFRF funded affordable housing development. And as many of you know, that's what you're here to learn about. My colleague Vinay will discuss how guidance we released under this eligible use category is designed to increase flexibility to use SLFRF to fully finance long-term affordable housing loans and expand presumptively eligible affordable housing uses to further maximize the availability of SLFRF funds for affordable housing. The next eligible use category is premium pay. Recipients can provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work, offering additional support to those who have experienced the greatest health risks of the COVID-19 pandemic because of their service in critical sectors. And the last eligible use category is water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Recipients can make necessary investments to improve access to clean drinking water, to support vital wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and expand affordable access to broadband internet. And that's all for the overview. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Vinay Nayak, a senior advisor to the Chief Recovery Officer, who will discuss the recently released affordable housing guidance in more detail. Vinay, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Namratha, and thank you to everyone who's joined this webinar for the work that you've done and that you're doing every single day. I'm going to provide a quick overview of our recently released guidance on affordable housing development and long-term loans, which can be found in Final Rule FAQs 2.14 and 4.9. In partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Treasury has developed a how-to guide. You can see the cover of it on the right of your screen, to summarize our guidance on affordable housing development and to provide additional information to recipients who are seeking to use state and local affordable housing dollars along with other sources of federal funding. State and local permits funds to be used, as Namratha said, among other uses, to respond to the public health and negative economic effects, or PHNEI, of the pandemic. And Treasury has updated its guidance to clarify 2 presumptively eligible ways to use state and local to fund affordable housing investments under the final rule, and to permit the use of PHNEI funds to fully finance long-term affordable housing loans. On the next slide, I'll talk about the presumptively eligible uses, which again are also described in a little bit of greater detail in the affordable housing guide that we encourage you to review after this presentation. As I said, there are two presumptively eligible uses under the updated guidance for affordable housing. Option 1 allows state and local funds to be used for affordable housing projects under PHNEI if a project meets certain core requirements of an expanded list of federal housing programs. As many of you know, in the final rule and associated guidance, there were two programs that were on a list for alignment with state and local dollars for presumptive eligible uses under the state and local final rule for affordable housing: the National Housing Trust Fund and the Home Program from HUD. As you'll see on this slide, there is now a significantly greater list of programs that are included. And as you'll see on the next slide, Treasury has also clarified what the core requirements of the programs that you're seeing here are that are necessary to qualify for presumptive eligibility. Those core requirements are resident income restrictions, the affordability period and related covenant, tenant protections, and housing quality standards. What that means in practice is that if a state and local affordable housing use aligns with these four core requirements of one of the list of programs that was shown on the prior slide, then that's a presumptively eligible use of state and local fiscal recovery dollars. Our goal here was to make the presumptively eligible uses as clear and as helpful as possible. And our hope is that this expanded list and additional clarity on what exactly it means to align with these programs will be helpful in allowing projects to move forward. If we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about option 2 for our presumptive eligibility. This is a new option in our updated guidance. And what this option says is that state and local funds that are used for affordable housing under PHNEI are presumptively eligible if the units funded serve households at or below 65% of the area median income for a period of 20 years or greater. What that means is that even if a use does not align with one of the programs previously specified, so long as the units funded, doesn't have to be all the units in a particular development, but so long as the units or the proportion of units that are funded are ones that, based on a covenant, serve individuals at 65% AMI or any level below for a 20-year period or greater, then that is also a presumptively eligible use of state and local fiscal recovery fund financing, even in a mixed income unit where only certain units are being funded using state and local. Now, I want to also be clear that a broader range of affordable housing investments may also be eligible uses of state and local fiscal recovery funds under the final rule, so long as they are related and reasonably proportional to addressing the economic effects of the pandemic and otherwise meet the final rule requirements. That's true even if they do not fall under one of these two presumptive eligible use categories. Depending on the needs of the local rental market, it may be, for instance, reasonably proportional to address the negative economic effects of the pandemic by funding units up to a higher income level, like 80% of the area median income, so long as it is reasonably proportional to meet the needs of the pandemic. Now we'll switch gears and take a look at our second update to our guidance on how recipients can use state and local to make long-term loans, including in deals involving LIHTC or the Low Income Housing Tax Credit for affordable housing. Now, Treasury has concluded that the features of certain long-term loans in the affordable housing context significantly mitigate concerns about funds being deployed for purposes of recycling funds, potentially for ineligible uses, following the program's expenditure deadline. What that means is that Treasury has determined that state and local funds may be used in the affordable housing context to finance certain long-term affordable housing loans, not just the subsidy cost of those loans, but also to finance the principal of those loans, so long as the project meets the following requirements. The loan must have a term of not less than 20 years. The housing project finance must have an affordability period of not less than 20 years for the particular units that are being funded using state and local dollars. And finally, to protect long-term affordability, the project owners of any property receiving state and local loans, these sorts of long-term loans that also receive LIHTC financing, must agree to waive their right to request a qualified contract. Now, these two updates to our guidance, we hope, will help to unlock additional dollars for affordable housing and may be helpful in increasing the scale and scope of commitments for affordable housing, as Jacob said, which is something that we at the Treasury Department have and will continue to strongly encourage. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ellen Lurie Hoffman, a senior policy advisor in the Office of Community and Economic Development at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. She will share information about the state and local affordable housing how-to guide that, as I discussed, was developed by Treasury in partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Thanks, Vinay. So Treasury partnered with our colleagues at HUD to develop the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund how-to guide, which provides a detailed explanation and examples of how SLFRF may be combined with a wide range of other federal, state, local, and private resources to meet housing needs. And just as a reminder, recipients using SLFRF in conjunction with another federal program must comply with all related statutory and regulatory requirements and policies of both programs, including the capital expenditure requirements and the requirement that if a project is only partially funded with SLFRF, the portion of the project funded must be an eligible use under the SLFRF program. So this slide provides examples of how federal resources may be combined with SLFRF to fund new construction and substantial rehabilitation of affordable housing. This is not an exhaustive or definitive list of layering possibilities, but we know that thousands of affordable housing projects around the nation face funding gaps due to the impacts of COVID-19, as well as the rising costs of supplies and labor. SLFRF may fill gaps and help projects which have been stalled to move forward, or it can be used to finance new projects. The how-to guide provides a detailed explanation for each resource listed here on pages 3 and 4 of the guide. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but I just want to highlight a few key points. SLFRF is a great source for gap financing to fill funding gaps for new construction or substantial rehabilitation of projects. And here are a few examples. Projects that have received an allocation of 9 or 4% low-income housing tax credits that have gaps to fill, or projects that may have received funds through the HUD's Home Program, the Home ARP American Rescue Plan Program, the National Housing Trust Fund, or community development block grant resources from their state or local government. SLFRF can also help with gap financing for projects with FHA multifamily mortgage insurance. Recipients may also think about whether they may want to layer SLFRF with project-based vouchers to help deeply target new or preserved units if those resources are available from their local housing authorities. And also, SLFRF may help fill in gaps in projects going through a substantial rehabilitation or repositioning of public housing through HUD's rental assistance demonstration. Or SLFRF could be used as a flexible source to support fair cloth to RAD housing transactions, which is a way that public housing authorities can add new affordable housing to their portfolio. At the end of the how-to guide, there are links providing more information on each of these programs on HUD's website. Next, I'll touch on what the how-to guide has to say about using SLFRF for rehabilitation and adaptive reuse. So recipients may use SLFRF to acquire properties that are going to be transitioned into affordable housing for households that have experienced the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. For example, the funds could be used for acquisition of market rate rental properties, motels, or commercial properties that will be converted to affordable housing, or acquisition and preservation of publicly supported affordable housing that already exists. SLFRF can also be used to finance retrofits and weatherization of properties to improve energy efficiency, and potentially it could leverage new federal funding such as the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program or infrastructure resources. Next slide, please. Another example of how to layer SLFRF with other resources to support rehab and adaptive reuse is to layer it with long-term multifamily mortgage insurance, which does allow for a modest number of repairs and energy efficiency retrofits as part of the transaction. A jurisdiction could layer SLFRF with an FHA insured loan to finance property acquisition or refinance. Recipients may also layer SLFRF resources with a risk share loan through the FHA HFA risk share program to fund the acquisition or refinancing of affordable properties. And as you may know, in the risk share model, HUD delegates authority to housing finance agencies to underwrite multifamily loans in exchange for taking on a portion of the risk. Right now, there are 37 state housing finance agencies that are approved to use risk share, and 22 of those have active programs with the Federal Financing Bank Risk Sharing Initiative, which enables them to maximize these purchase and refinance opportunities. Next slide, please. SLFRF may also be used to convert vacant or abandoned properties to affordable housing in disproportionately impacted communities. And here are some examples of how they can do that. You can layer SLFRF with the Section 108 loan guarantee programs for the eligible portion of a mixed-use development. You can combine SLFRF with home or housing trust fund resources to provide deeply affordable units within mixed income developments. SLFRF may be utilized to convert office buildings to condominiums for home ownership. SLFRF may be employed to finance the conversion of industrial or commercial properties to housing, or SLFRF could be used to acquire vacant lots for affordable housing development. Again, these are all just examples, and we provide them just for illustrative purposes. Next slide, please. Finally, SLFRF may be available to recipients to help fund pre-project development activities, which could include site work as well as land acquisition that precedes housing development or the rehabilitation of affordable housing. And here are a couple of examples of how this could be done. For land acquisition, recipients could use SLFRF to acquire land for future development or within existing land acquisition programs for the purposes of affordable housing investments, including those funded with HUD CDBG or Section 108 loan guarantee program funds. And for pre-development and site work, SLFRF could be used for pre-development activity and site work to lay the ground for affordable housing development. That's all for the how-to guide for now. For more information, we recommend that you take a look at the guide on the SLFRF website, read through it carefully. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Laura McDaniel, who will share a few examples of promising practices that we're seeing with the use of these funds.
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, I'm here to share with you a few promising examples of how recipients are using state and local fiscal recovery funds for affordable housing development. The first example I'll share with you is from the Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians, who have set aside close to $5 million of their state and local funds to assist the tribe's housing authority with new construction projects. The first is a 24-unit acquisition rehab project, and the second is a 20+ unit community building and new construction project. In Illinois, the Illinois Housing Development Authority has been allocated $75 million to provide gap funding for qualified developments eligible for federal low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC projects. The grant funds will help developers overcome increased construction costs related to pandemic-created supply shortages, including but not limited to increases for lumber and other materials. So far, they've expended more than $23 million of their total allocation. The state of Rhode Island committed $12 million of their state and local funds to invest in creating more homes for households earning up to 80% of the area median income by providing grants to purchase properties for future development of affordable housing. In all, 15 properties will be acquired, accommodating an estimated 540 affordable units. 5% of those units will be for permanent supportive housing. There is a 9-month closing requirement, and each grant will be less than $1 million. By supporting the development of affordable and supportive housing, this program will address inequities and close gaps for communities that are disproportionately affected by homelessness and housing instability, including low-income Rhode Islanders and Rhode Islanders of color. To increase housing supply, the state is creating a pipeline of sites ready for redevelopment. To date, they've expended $5.9 million of their SLFRF investment for this purpose. Finally, in Greenville, South Carolina, the county is allocating $10 million of state and local fiscal recovery funds to invest in affordable housing. The county partnered with the Greenville County Redevelopment Authority to oversee and administer the allocated funding and work collaboratively with other nonprofits in the affordable housing arena. The $10 million will be divided into 3 tranches of funding: production of multifamily and single-family affordable housing units, preservation of current affordable housing units, and potentially a new signature project that will be located in a qualified census tract and would include new infrastructure as well as new multifamily units. $5 million of the budgeted amount has been expended to date. And with that, I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Namrata.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. And I just want to note that we really appreciate hearing about the examples of exciting work that's happening with recipients. For the recipients who are on the call, we very much look forward to seeing how you're putting these funds to use for affordable housing supply. And we're heartened to see that many of you are looking to expand your use of SLFRF for affordable housing. So we look forward to working with you as you look to address the remaining questions and implementing these funds. So now I'm going to turn it to my colleagues who will help answer some of the questions that you submitted when registering for this webinar. And as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and you can learn more about the SLFRF program and affordable housing using the links that we included in the chat. So the first question we have is that once funds are paid back from a loan, can we reuse the funds or do they have to be repaid to Treasury? And I would like to turn it to Vinay to answer that question.
Thank you so much, Namrata, and thank you to the folks who've asked this question. I've also seen it in the chat, and I think it's a really, really important question. The answer to the question is yes. For these affordable housing uses, when we're talking about a long-term loan and the interest or principal of the loan, the answer is yes. Grantees may reinvest the income into affordable housing, and there is no need to pay this income back to Treasury. So specifically, recipients are able to retain repayments of principal as well as payments of interest for those qualifying long-term loans that we discussed earlier, the 20-year loans with the 20-year affordability covenant, and that those repayments are not subject to state and local program income rules. That applies both for payments of principal or interest that are made during the period of performance, as well as for payments of principal or interest that are paid after the period of performance. One more point that I want to make on this is just to clarify that these kinds of long-term loans that we went over earlier are considered expended at the time that the funds are dispersed to the borrower. And that's something that's also available in the FAQ as well as in the guide. So folks can take a look at that to have a better understanding, but just wanted to clarify that that's the point of expenditure, is when the loans are actually dispersed to the borrower. Thank you, Namrata.
Great. And for our next question, we got a few questions. One, which was, would building group homes be eligible? And if so, what are the stipulations? We got another question, which was, what about if I'm building housing outside of a QCT? So generally, the question we'd like to answer here is, how do I determine if my project is eligible under this guidance? And I would like to turn it over to Ellen to answer that question.
Thanks, Namratha. So projects such as group homes may be eligible under affordable housing eligible uses if they align with the program eligibility requirements described in the final rule and FAQ 2.14. If the units or the development meet the presumptive eligibility requirements that we reviewed during this webinar, such as alignment with other housing programs, or limited to individuals at or below 65% of area median income for a period of 20 years or longer with tenant protections and housing quality standards, this use would be a presumptively eligible affordable housing use. And just as a reminder, recipients also have the flexibility to design other affordable housing projects beyond those eligible under the presumptions described earlier, if they are related and if they are reasonably proportional to addressing the negative economic impacts of the pandemic and otherwise meet the final rule's requirements. There is no requirement that affordable housing be built on a qualified census tract. In the final rule and follow-on guidance, we have provided broad flexibility on the use of funds for affordable housing in communities impacted by the pandemic. And FAQ 2.14 provides the best summary of this guidance. Depending on the functions of the group home, such as services for certain populations, there may be additional ways to use SLFRF to provide services using the final rule's eligible uses to respond to pandemic impacts.
Great, thank you so much for answering that question. And I'll take our next question, which is, if funding multiple properties, should that be one FRF project or a separate FRF project for each affordable housing site? So to answer this question, a project includes expenditures that are interdependent. For example, acquisition of land, construction. Let's say you're doing a school project, it would be acquisition of the land, construction of the school on the land, and purchase of school equipment. That would all be one project for those interdependent activities. Expenditures that would be utilized for a common purpose or are for the same or similar type would also be one project, such as a development of multiple affordable housing complexes. And again, these are projects as definition for reporting purposes. Recipients must not segment a larger project into smaller projects to evade review. A recipient undertaking a set of identical or similar projects, for example, development of a number of new affordable housing complexes across the recipient jurisdiction, may complete one capital expenditure written justification to comprehensively address an entire set of projects. You can find information in the final rule about the definition of a project on page 4392. Please also see the compliance and reporting guidance, which is linked to on our website. And for that guidance, you should look to pages 19, 28, and 31 for more information on reporting projects and written justifications. And for the next question, we'll cover this one, which is, can ARPA funds be used to put money into affordable housing trust fund? And for ARPA funds, we assume that the person asking this question meant state and local fiscal recovery funds. Ellen, I will turn it over to you to answer that question.
Great, thanks, Namratha. So a recipient may contribute SLFRF funds into a housing trust fund as long as the uses of the housing trust fund resources are restricted to the eligible uses in the SLFRF final rule and Treasury's guidance. FAQ 2.14 provides guidance on how funds can be used for affordable housing. Additionally, if funds are being provided in the form of a loan, either to the Housing Trust Fund or by the Housing Trust Fund to its beneficiaries, we recommend that recipients review FAQ 4.9. Depositing funds into a housing trust fund may be considered a sub-award, but this kind of deposit, not associated with a particular project, would not constitute an expenditure of funds. As a result, recipients and housing trust funds should be mindful of the obligation and expenditure timelines for the use of funds. And for more on that, please see page 43 of the overview of the final rule.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. And that's all the time we have for reviewing questions and answers. On our next slide, you'll find contact information about the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program. We recommend that you find the links to the Affordable Housing How-To Guide and the Final Rule FAQs on our website. The Affordable Housing How-To Guide is a summary of the FAQs that we recently released, which were 2.14 and 4.9 discussed on this webinar. The Affordable Housing How-To Guide also discusses the layering opportunities that Ellen covered. And please refer to the Final Rule FAQs for complete details on how to use state and local fiscal recovery funds for the purposes we just discussed. There were some questions in the chat that were covered by those FAQs. So we just recommend that as you think of questions, look at the FAQs, try to see if it's already answered there, because that will be your best guidance as you move forward. If you have questions about this guidance or questions that are not discussed in our FAQs and the guidance, please email us at slfrf@treasury.gov. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing to deploy these funds to ensure an equitable economic recovery. We look forward to working with you as you use these funds for affordable housing development.